our first case study is going to come from Megan Foggin, who's the DCT lead at IQVIA. Megan has 14 years experience in the Australian clinical research industry, both in pharma and CROs. Megan is going to be talking with us about a strategy that IQVIA put together for a fully remote study and the lessons that were learned from this experience. So a big thank you to Megan. Our second case study is going to come from Belinda Fazekas, who's at the University of Technology, Sydney, at the Impact Trials Coordination Centre. Belinda is going to be sharing her experiences of working with palliative and terminally ill participants who are often not able to travel for trial-related activities. Belinda will outline some of the strategies that have been implemented in the context of this vulnerable participant group, including in the context of trial design and implementation. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Megan to kick us off.
Thank you. And yeah, great to be here. You're probably familiar with Liz Wilson from IQVIA that tends to attend a lot of the CTIQ events, and she was one of the people that couldn't be here today. So I'll be sharing some insights about a project that I was involved in that, like the intro said, that was essentially scoped to include all remote capabilities. And it's really aligned with, I suppose, my role at IQVIA, kind of looking at patient-centric solutions, things that we can incorporate into particularly the local business that will support the way that we run projects here. So in this example, the sponsor really challenged us to put together a completely remote study. We had, I suppose, done this in a global context before. We worked on a lot of studies that included kind of big budgets, all the bells and whistles, and therefore kind of scope to involve our big global solutions and DCT activities. But we hadn't had experience doing that locally here in Australia. So we set to work with, I suppose, leveraging what the global group can offer, what we could offer locally, and then off to our partners and vendors to see how they could support us in delivering a project like that. It was an interesting one, I suppose, for us as well. So it was a local sponsor that was keen on making the most of the R&D tax incentive. So all of the solutions not only had to be delivered here because it was a study running here, but I suppose project managed and coordinated from here as well, which was new for us. So I suppose the first point that we started at with this study was really looking at the patient pathway or patient journey. There's lots of kind of terminology around this, but essentially who the patients are, how they're diagnosed and by who, how they travel along that disease pathway and who they're interacting with, what the standard of care treatment is here in Australia and if there's reimbursement, so we could really map out, you know, what the typical pathway would look like, and then overlay that with the protocol expectations, the time and event schedule, the inclusion exclusion criteria, all the timelines around that to kind of see how we would operationalise it. We really had to critically assess what the study endpoints were and what data they were expecting and how they really needed that. So what were the key data points? What were the endpoints? How did we need to provide that, and which parts of that data therefore could be collected by the participant themselves? What needed to be collected by an investigator or a coordinator or a home health nurse if we were looking at doing it at the participant's home? And I suppose look at the risks associated with those so we could kind of pick out where the key assessments needed to happen and by who. So I suppose keeping all that in mind, we put together a proposal that involved a lot of different kind of decentralized remote elements. So the first was a recruitment vendor to do the digital marketing, digital outreach, I suppose, get the interest of participants and funnel them through. So through a pre-screening website, potentially phone calls if there's extra things that they needed to clarify before referring them to a site. And in terms of the sites, we really had to look at kind of high capacity sites that could take a big volume of patients in a short amount of time. So I suppose a traditional study would look at covering all key regions in the country. We were looking at probably 2 or 3 sites that could facilitate a completely remote solution, and that could look to enrol about 50 patients each per month over 9 months. So really have capabilities to manage all of those participants in such a short amount of time. We included e-consent, home nursing, telehealth appointments for all the visits that didn't need a home nurse, participant self-testing, which I suppose was pretty new for us. We identified that they would be able to do some nasal swabs themselves, blood pressure monitoring and pulse oximetry, so providing them with the tools that they needed to do that. E-pros, drug shipping to and from the participant's home, and a remote way of doing drug reconciliation as well. So I suppose, so this is an interesting one. We're still actually bidding for the project, so hopefully at some point we can come back here and share some lived lessons learned. But I suppose I wanted to kind of wrap up and share some considerations that we had when we were preparing this, and I suppose some lessons learned from doing that process up until this point. And I suppose the first one was, we were very lucky in that we could leverage from a lot of knowledge and lessons learned from our own business. So we did a lot of studies, the COVID studies, particularly during lockdown, which was, I suppose, a different kettle of fish, but looking at the same stuff. So it was a lot more reactive, and we need to get all of these things happening remotely versus this time kind of planning for that and integrating them all. It was really important, I suppose, to look at how we can be flexible and patient-centric, but also think about, you know, do our sites want to work in this way? Do the participants that we think we know would be suitable for this study want to work in that way? I suppose, how many vendors we were looking at using to deliver a solution like that, and trying to minimise that. So I suppose there were less points of contact, there were less integration potential issues, and we needed a one-stop shop, I suppose, a single sign-in solution that participants and site staff could log in and do all of those remote things or manage all of those remote things in one stop. I suppose an awareness that these kind of decentralized elements, you know, sound nice and easy in theory, but in actual fact, they come with their own burdens, and probably more burdens than how we're doing them now. So I suppose mapping them out from a risk perspective, and that involved a lot of time looking at how we would operationalise a study. So really step by step, visit by visit, assessment by assessment, who's doing what, how it would work, what's the time that we needed to do all of this, how does all of that data get back? Yeah, there was probably a lot more time than we anticipated in really nutting all of that out and finding out where the risks were and proposing how we would mitigate those with the sponsor. I suppose that things can get very complicated really quickly. So thinking about what vendors and partners we would use to ensure that, I suppose, it's an all local group and that everybody's nimble and flexible and being able to work together when problems arise, because we have a really short time frame to fix it for that particular participant's experience. Involving all of the key players from the start, and I suppose that's the difference from the kind of COVID style studies that we've done before, where we were able to kind of bring the sites in, bring all of the vendors in, bring all of the key players in to have these discussions and talk about how we would work together to address any issues. And the last one that I wanted to kind of bring up is that diversity is probably easier said than done in some of these studies. So we were really committed to opening up the study to recruit anywhere in Australia. But when we've got short timelines for screening and enrolment, when we've got home nurses that need to get to participants' homes, drug that needs to arrive at a certain time. We're heavily reliant on technology and internet connections. In reality, that really limited our scope and recruitment potential. So whilst I suppose we thought we were doing a lot of these things, in actual fact, it was probably more aligned with kind of our traditional metro sites and maybe like an hour or two outside of that. But that was about it. So hopefully those insights and lessons learned were helpful. I'm happy to take clarification questions if we want to do that now, but really interested in thoughts later on too.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes, so if anyone wants to ask Megan clarification or drill into more detail,
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether you're able to share, but what was the reason behind the request for a fully remote study? Was it
This was an infectious disease study, so we wanted to, partly we wanted to kind of keep them out of the hospital systems if we could, but I suppose also from the sponsor's perspective, it was a way to get a diverse set of participants and to ensure that we could hit the recruitment targets by, I suppose, opening up the potential spots that they could come from. Yeah.
I know that you mentioned that you've just submitted the proposal, but what was the rough timeline on how long it took to organise all of that?
Good question. Probably about 2 months end to end. So we've kind of been thinking about it early on and having some initial discussions. But I suppose there was a lot that the sponsor hadn't necessarily anticipated. And we kind of worked with them gradually rather than kind of like a big pitch at the end, to really kind of set their expectations about things like, we're going to post drug. Well, actually you can't post drug. We need to get vendors involved and all this stuff. So I suppose just like resetting expectations each step of the way probably took about 2 months to get to a final point. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed it, and you might not be able to share it, but did you mention the disease area that you were
So it was an infectious study is probably all I could talk about right now. Yeah.
Was it a cold chain product?
It was no, it was room temperature, which made it a lot easier in terms of getting drug around.
Yeah, okay.
You were talking about considering what potential participants would do, what they thought.
Yeah.
Like, in that timeline, were you able to work with consumers?
Yeah, so our experience was more with recruitment vendors and their networks, but the sponsor had done a lot of that engagement themselves and the work up with the protocol. So they had a good idea of how, I suppose, what potential patients were thinking and what they would be open to in terms of decentralised stuff.
Sometimes when we explore, hi everyone, I'm Carrie from GSK. Sometimes when we explore DCT models with our sites to help recruit and to give patients access to the trial, we've had resistance because our site staff say it's not going to work for them.
Yeah.
It's more efficient just for patients to come in and just line up.
Yeah.
And also for the patients might not want it because the patients want to come in.
Yeah.
I think we need to ask the patient
Yeah.
the question, but how did you go about, when you have some sites engaged you, how did you get them on board with the idea if they're experienced as traditional non-DCT?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we were very cognizant of that. So what sites had in terms of the infrastructure, they might have their own DCT elements or solutions and things that they wanted to use, recruitment partners, all of that stuff. So it was really around, I suppose, being as open and honest with the different sites that we could, as early that we could in the feasibility process, to let them know, what the expectations of the study were, what the, I suppose, wishes of the sponsors were, and how that fit in with them. So I suppose from our perspective, we were definitely keen on having the kind of bricks and mortar sites as well, or at least an option. So placing the couple of sites that we proposed to the sponsors in capital cities where participants could have the opportunity to come if they wanted or not. But yeah, definitely a big consideration. And I think, there's ideas from sponsors and different people about what participants want, but yeah, being realistic about that was really challenging, I suppose, for us and making sure that everyone was aligned. But I'd say the biggest piece was just being as transparent as we could with all of the parties throughout the process.
I'll take a question from Kath and then I think we'll move on to Belinda.
Can I just ask what was the length of the treatment protocol?
Good question. So it was a super short screening period of about 5 days. There was a treatment period of about 2 weeks and then a follow-up. So they were kind of done and dusted in a month. So for the sites that are recruiting 50 patients a month, but jamming them into a month, they were busy.
I just had a quick question about the pre-screening website. I'd made some assumptions that it might have been a participant who was filling that in. So who was actually, could participants self-recruit, or was it specialists?
Yeah.
Specialists or GPs? What was the process for
Great
participants to find
question.
the trial?
Yeah, and we looked at a bunch of different vendors with different solutions to kind of see how that would fit. So looking at ones that kind of played in the GP space, but we were limited there because the screening time was so short. In reality, trying to get GPs to refer would have been impossible. So it was more around the digital marketing, getting the awareness out on social media and things like that, search engines. So participants would essentially self-refer, so they would click the link, go to a landing page to find out more about the study, and then pre-screen themselves with specific questions, and if they were eligible, then they would connect through to a site that would pick them up from there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan.
Pleasure.
I'm going to pass us over to Belinda.
Thanks everyone. So I'm Belinda Fazekas and I work at the University of Technology Sydney. I'm the National Project Officer for 2 collaborative groups. One is the Palliative Care Collaborative, looking at palliative care patients, and the other one is Cancer Symptom Trials, where we're looking at the trials related to symptom management. So from that you kind of understand that we're looking at trials, usually phase 3 trials, at the end of life, which presents a lot of challenges in itself. And I might respond to some of your questions because they just blow my mind. So in terms of flexible trial delivery, our trials actually come from our memberships. So they come from, the concepts for the trials come from the clinicians who have a clinical question that they want to develop, or from researchers. And so when they come from clinicians, they come through a kind of a pathway through the collaboratives. And the development of the protocol entirely rests around the patients who are end of life or very, very ill, and the needs of the clinical teams. So we build into the protocols themselves the flexibility to allow those kind of conditions to be met. So Megan, you mentioned your short protocols. Sometimes our protocols are 3 days.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just don't have very much time to work with. So we have inclusion and exclusion criteria that are absolutely aimed at including the patients who would into the future be the ones using that treatment in clinical care. We're looking at exclusion criteria that are primarily related to safety, and they're kept to an absolute minimum. We look at protocols where the time frames are very strictly reviewed and adjusted, so that we're not asking patients to be on a trial that might be 4 weeks when they might, that their condition can change so much in that 4 weeks that they just won't be able to participate. So the trial design itself is kind of integral to the way that we run these trials. We build in very flexible visit windows so that patients who are at home on these trials have you know, if they're not available for one day, there's flexibility built in for 1 or 2 days either side of that, so that patients can still be spending time with their families, doing things on days when they feel they're able to do things, rather than stay home and wait for a protocol visit. We build that flexibility in. And so it's all kind of revolving around the patient. The visit place itself, or the place of care, can be flexible, and that's also built into the protocols. Most of the time we try and keep the patient or the participant in their home, and they are part of the study while they're in their home. We try and build in flexibility to the protocol to allow patients, if they want to, they can come to the trial site and see the study team at the hospital, or they can stay at home. It builds up a few challenges when people are at home, but most of our trial teams have got links to community or outreach palliative care services. And so where possible, we make use of those services. The individual trial sites will create or already have those links, and be able to arrange their visits to coincide with the clinical visits, if you like, so that there's not too many visits at too many days of the week. Or sometimes the trial teams can work with the clinical team to have them do that or conduct that particular review. Now obviously that will depend on the study and also the capability of the team, but we are often able to conduct with those small teams the training, and for them to be able to meet the requirements of those particular visits. In terms of actually implementing the protocols, again, we try and build in enough flexibility to enable the patient or the participant to do as much as they're able to do within the limitations of their disease process. So the assessments that are conducted are usually scheduled from the most important to the ones that we'd like. So the most important ones are those related to safety and primary outcome. And sometimes, on some visits, that might be all we get. Other times, you know, we'll get some of the secondary outcome. They might be quality of life or other symptom assessments, but if they're not collected, it's kind of expected that and accepted that that's going to be the limit of what we can get. So we don't expect or require that patients go above and beyond what they feel physically able to do. We just limit it to those. In terms of those assessments, they are usually, particularly the primary outcome, is usually a patient-reported outcome. In the most part, we're looking at medications for symptom management, and symptoms being subjective, we're asking the participant themselves to provide that assessment. Sometimes that's in the form of a diary so that the patient can fill it out themselves when they're able to, sometimes with the help of a carer, but they're more aimed at the person themselves providing that information than having a test or some kind of physical kind of assessment. In terms of consenting patients, we've tried over the years to introduce a bit of flexibility there. So some of our studies we have tried to, and been successful in some part, to gain or ask the patient to consider the study and consent to the study prior to the condition of interest actually becoming evident. So we called it pre-consent. I don't know how it's termed in other places. And that consent stands, but then when the patient actually develops that condition or that symptom of interest, the consent is obviously then reconfirmed, but they're able to consider the study at a time when they're still well enough to think about it. And that brings up its own challenges because you're introducing a trial and management of a symptom that the patient yet doesn't have. And that's where the study team and the clinical team need to work really closely together so that those explanations and those really challenging discussions can take place. We've had some success with having postal consent, with telephone support and interaction. Having said that, it's been very, very challenging at times to ask the participant to just be able to post the consent form back. You know, these poor people, you know, they have multiple comorbidities, multiple medications, their families, you know, the last thing they've got on their mind is to, you know, run down to the post box and put this thing in. So, you know, there's varying degrees of success. Most of our success is face-to-face consenting, whether it be in a clinic at the time when they're being seen or in their own home. That seems to be the way that they can manage it. I might just mention one of the perhaps big challenges that we've had, and I think it's on the agenda today, about technology. We thought COVID, you know, was just going to make everything so much easier. You know, everybody was technology, you know, Zoom and Teams and this and this. And in fact, that was not the case for our trials at all. We find that our participants are not technology savvy, and their carer, who's often an elderly partner, is also not technology savvy. The people that have the technology are the children of the patients, and they're not there, you know, at the times that they need to be. So our trials are still very non-technology based, because that's just the way it kind of works.
Amazing.
Owners, was there another vendor? What was that process?
So most of our sites, the research teams are generally already embedded within the palliative care service, and the palliative care services often have their own outreach or community services as part of what they do. And so, for example, a lot of cases where the PI of the study is also the medical officer who's caring for that patient, and they are able to go into the patient home. We don't outsource it. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply for all of our sites, but again, the protocol itself is designed in such a way to allow for either home visiting or within the hospital itself, depending on the local arrangements. Yeah.
Mark.
The trials usually investigator initiated or sponsor initiated, usually I
Yeah, so UTS does act as the sponsor, but they're all investigator led trials. They're almost exclusively competitive funding or local funding.
Given the heavy involvement of carers, are there any times where the carer are actually the ones who are recruited rather than the patient at the end of life, because they're the ones who will be there at the end to get results? And yeah, just wondering what sort of communication you have with the carers and loved ones.
Yeah, so the carers are usually involved along with the participant. but you know, we might be looking at trials that are looking at nausea or pain management or breathlessness, bowel obstruction, you know, some of those kind of symptoms. So we do ask for carer input as well, particularly around burden of care and their assessment of the impact of that symptom. But when we're wanting to look at someone's response to a medication, we really need the patient themselves to answer. And one of the things I didn't say was that usually those medications are already on the market. They're just being used for a different indication, different population, different route, those kind of things. But the carers are usually an integral part of what we collect.
Yeah, about a year ago now, I started working with Chemist Warehouse because they were wanting to offer a different service to their customers that some of the other pharmacies weren't. And what was really interesting for me is that they have more than 550 stores across Australia. And when you look at the map of where the population is and looking at the, scale of, how many people are in each area, they've really picked where they put their shops very well. So the whole purpose of this is so that we can deliver trials to more people. So Obvio Health, it's gone out of fashion now, which is not good because it's the name of my thesis, but decentralized clinical trials. We've gone to virtual trials now, but we do a lot more hybrid or site-based here in Australia. And offer our eCOA patient app-facing solution. So the idea is that let's go to where the patients are. So we're able to offer a number of services through Chemist Warehouse, really dependent on the therapeutic area, what the actual medication is. So I'll just give you a couple of different examples of how we're using it. So one example is we were involved in looking at a rescue study where they had a lot of difficulty recruiting at the oncology sites through the oncologists. So instead, what we put together, study ended up closing, so it didn't actually get off the ground. We got everything in place and then they decided to close the study. But what we had put together was that we had worked with Chemist Warehouse and their data warehouse, and so what they had done for us is they had worked out where the stores were that we were most likely to, where they were prescribing the most that fit the requirements of the study. So where they had the most patients that had had less than 3 scripts filled that were between certain ages. So we were able to get that level of specificity from them. So then we went down the route of picking the top 10 across Australia for the number of patients we were looking for. That worked out. And so what we did then was we had from the study team, they had their chief medical officer put together a video presentation and quiz for the pharmacists to complete that gave them just a brief intro to what the study was about. And then we produced flyers that they were given, and when they dispensed the medication, when they put it through on their computer system, a pop-up came up saying this patient's potentially eligible. Let them know about the study. They then had a stack of flyers sitting right next to the computer there. And so Chemist Warehouse aren't involved in the study at all. They're simply, for this study, they were simply just a route to tell patients about the study that we had. So then they were going to be giving out, as the patient collected their medication, they were going to be given a flyer going, this is a study that our partners are running. You could be eligible. If you're interested, here's the QR code. That's where they stop. Then Chemist Warehouse also owns a telehealth company. And so we had trained the investigators from the telehealth company, and so the doctors there, they tend to be sort of registrars in some of the big public hospitals, or people doing their training, and there's a couple of GPs and things in there. So they've been trained on the study just as any PI would be trained on the study. So if a patient pre-screens from the QR code as eligible, and then they get a copy of the consent to read, then they acknowledge that they are interested, and they get onto a video call within 2 hours usually, during like 7 till 7 on an app. They get onto a video call with the investigator, ask all the questions, PI explains the study, goes through all of that process. The patient is then scheduled for a follow-up call at least 1 day later, just to give them the time to review the consent form and everything. And then if they're still happy to go ahead, they jump on the call the next day and they're consented via e-consent with the investigator. Then for this study, it was primarily quality of life and survival that we were looking at. So it was primarily based on ePROs. There was an element of eCOA in that what happened was a letter went to their oncologist and asked them to CC in any staging, screening tests that they had, but also the patients themselves could provide a copy of the letter by taking a photo of it in the app and sending it to the investigator of the study so that they could review it and fill out just a typical ECRF form to say that patient's alive, patient hasn't progressed. So that's where we went with that study. If we go the opposite end, there's a study that is opening very soon for autism. And so this is actually just a one-off visit as a pre-screener to look for particular genetic marker. So in that case, we are going to be having, we've got currently being printed, the flyers that are going to be posted. I'm sure if you haven't been to Chemist Warehouse, you've seen it at other ones where near the dispensing counter, they've got posters for, book your flu vaccine now, that kind of thing. Right next to that, there's going to be a flyer about the study. And as well, they have their House of Wellness magazine. So the head of the company that's running the study, so who came up with this whole concept, she's going to be interviewed in that to also just do a bit of educational community piece about what they've actually been doing. And so through those two channels, we are just mass putting it out there that you can register for this study. Patients scan, sign up for it, do a basic pre-screener in the app, deemed eligible, they're given more information to read about the study. If they're interested, they then register their address and how far they're willing to travel to participate. Then, if once we have 5 patients within sort of a radius, we're going to have a pop-up clinic in a Chemist Warehouse back room where they do the vaccines. So we have contracted investigators, a couple across Australia, and we already have study coordinators who are contracted to us who are going to go to the Chemist Warehouses and do a pop-up clinic for a day. The patients will book through the app what time they want to come in, all of that stuff. They'll be reminded, they'll be sent information beforehand in our app. They show up on the day, they're checked in by the study coordinator, and then they complete the questionnaires they need to do on their app. And then they go in and do the physical assessment and the interview that they need to do with the PI. And then they get their bloods done at one of the big national chains we've got an agreement with to do their bloods afterwards. So that's just 2 kind of options. There's heaps of other ways that we can access, I've mentioned a heap of different services there that we can partner with Chemist Warehouse for. So really depending on the indication and the requirements of the trial, we can be really flexible in adding in our own. We can use them simply for recruitment, or we can go through to that point where at site, like at a Chemist Warehouse, they're actually receiving the treatment if it's something like a vaccine, or they're picking up their meds, or they're performing the study tasks there.
Amazing, thank you, Taylor. So I can see morning tea being set up at the back, so let's just have a couple of clarificatory questions, and then feel free to ask any of our case study presenters additional questions during morning tea. So, Kat.
Very quickly, sometimes I have to wrangle some people to get a calendar appointment and it takes a higher order degree. How successful is the, once you've got 5 people within a radius, being able to get them at the same time to that clinic?
Yeah, so we have done similar, not at Chemist Warehouse, but we've done similar for another study where they were going to actual sites. And because there was they have self-nominated to be part of it, it's not linked to, you know, their own healthcare. There's a benefit to them in that they're getting the genetic results for this. So, and the other studies we've done are similar. There's a strong incentive for them to participate. So they've been quite eager to be involved. We've done in the past as well where we do, you know, a couple of days in a row so we can give them a window to participate.
Just going to say, just on the back of that question then, Taylor, so with the genetic test results, is that outsourced, or do you have genetic counsellors?
So then the genetic counsellors it's outsourced through the company doing the testing.
Yeah. Do you use Blueprint or Invitae? Do you know which one you use?
That I can't tell you.
No,
I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm not allowed to tell you who it is. That's
No,
yes.
it's absolutely fine.
But yes, it's outsourced so that it's a qualified genetic counsellor that is communicating with them, and then they will be invited, if they do have the marker, to participate in the follow-up study, to register to hear when the follow-up study for that genetic marker happens.
What happens if there's somebody who's living quite remotely and you don't get that 5? Is there a time period that you get back in touch with them?
Yeah, so, you know, we're going to leave it that they can just basically join a wait list. You know, we'll say there's nothing booked currently for your area. Are you happy for us to contact you when we do have an appointment? Otherwise, are you willing to travel further? And give them contact details that they can follow up with that study, one of the study coordinators that we're contracting to follow up on that. But because they'll have downloaded the app, we'll say keep your app downloaded on your phone, and we'll give you updates. And so we have in our app, we have both automated and personal chat messages that we push through there to let them know the current status.